Organs Without Bodies. Deleuze and Consequences. By Slavoj Zizek. Fantasy. The ontological scandal of the notion of fantasy resides in the fact that it subverts the standard opposition of subjective and objective. Of course, fantasy is, by definition, not objective, in the naive sense of existing independently of the subject's perceptions. However, it is also not subjective, in the sense of being reducible to the subject's consciously experienced intuitions. Rather, fantasy belongs to the bizarre category of the objectively subjective, the way things actually, objectively seem to you even if they don't seem that way to you. When, for example, we claim that someone who is consciously well disposed toward Jews nonetheless harbors profound anti-Semitic prejudices he is not consciously aware of, do we not claim that, insofar as these prejudices do not render the way Jews really are but render the way they appear to him, he is not aware of how Jews really seem to him? Apropos of commodity fetishism, Marx himself uses the term objectively necessary appearance. So, when a critical Marxist encounters a bourgeois subject immersed in commodity fetishism, the Marxist's reproach to him is not the commodity may seem to you to be a magical object endowed with special powers, but it really is just a reified expression of relations between people. The actual Marxist's reproach is, rather, you may think that the commodity appears to you as a simple embodiment of social relations, that, for example, money is just a kind of voucher entitling you to a part of the social product, but this is not how things really seem to you in your social reality. By means of your participation in social exchange, you bear witness to the uncanny fact that a commodity really appears to you as a magical object endowed with special powers. This is what Marx is aiming at in his famous fiction of commodities that start to speak to each other. If commodities could speak, they would say this: our use value may interest men, but it does not belong to us as objects. What does belong to us as objects, however, is our value. Our own intercourse as commodities proves it. We relate to each other merely as exchange values. Marx quotes here ironically Dogberry's advice to Seco Al from Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, Act 3, Scene 3, which concludes Chapter 1 of Capital: to be a well-favored man is the gift of fortune, but reading and writing comes by nature. This reversal is not simply a fiction in the sense of subjective illusion. On the contrary, its status is objective, that of objective appearance, of how things effectively appear to me, as opposed to how they immediately appear to me. The categories of bourgeois economics are forms of thought which are socially valid, and therefore objective, for the relations of production belonging to this historically determined mode of social production, i.e. commodity production. In March 2003, Donald Rumsfeld engaged in a little bit of amateur philosophizing about the relationship between the known and the unknown. There are known knowns. These are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know we don't know. What he forgot to add was the crucial fourth term, the unknown knowns, things we don't know that we know, which is precisely the Freudian unconscious, the knowledge which doesn't know itself, as Lacan used to say. If Rumsfeld thinks that the main dangers in the confrontation with Iraq are the unknown unknowns, the threats from Saddam about which we do not even suspect what they may be, what we should reply is that the main dangers are, on the contrary, the unknown knowns, the disavowed beliefs and suppositions we are not even aware of adhering to ourselves. The risk to be taken is to assume these phantasmatic unknowns. In a story by Somerset Maugham from the 1920s, an Englishman in his 40s, who, for decades, worked in colonial Shanghai, finally earns enough to realize the dream that sustained him through the years to move to London and live the comfortable life of a bachelor there. However, after a couple of weeks in London, he gets terribly bored and depressed, and starts to long for the life back in Shanghai, so, he boards a boat back to China. But, on the long trip back, while the boat makes a stop in Hanoi, he leaves it and remains permanently in Hanoi. After being disappointed by the realization of a lifetime dream, he knows that he cannot afford another such experience, so he decides to stay forever close to China, forever dreaming about how nice life would have been in Shanghai. This is what Lacan means by compromising one's desire, the refusal to traverse one's fantasy by way of risking its actualization. This is also one of the ways of specifying the meaning of Lacan's assertion of the subject's constitutive désintéressement. Its point is not that my subjective experience is regulated by objective unconscious mechanisms that are désintéressed with regard to my self-experience and, as such, beyond my control, a point asserted by every materialist, but, rather, is something much more unsettling. I am deprived of even my most intimate subjective experience, the way things really seem to me, that of the fundamental fantasy that constitutes and guarantees the core of my being, since I can never consciously experience it and assume it. According to the standard view, the dimension that is constitutive of subjectivity is that of phenomenal, self, experience. I am a subject the moment I can say to myself, no matter what unknown mechanism governs my acts, perceptions, and thoughts, nobody can take from me what I see and feel now. Say, when I am passionately in love, and a biochemist informs me that all my intense sentiments are just the result of biochemical processes in my body, I can answer him by clinging to the appearance, all that you're saying may be true, but, nonetheless, nothing can take from me the intensity of the passion that I am experiencing now. Lacan's point, however, is that the psychoanalyst is the one who, precisely, can take this from the subject. His ultimate aim is to deprive the subject of the very fundamental fantasy that regulates the universe of his self experience. The Freudian subject of the unconscious emerges only when a key aspect of the subject's phenomenal self experience, his fundamental fantasy, becomes inaccessible to him, i.e., is primordially repressed. At its most radical, the unconscious is the inaccessible phenomenon, not the objective mechanism that regulates my phenomenal experience. So, in contrast to the commonplace that we are dealing with a subject the moment an entity displays signs of inner life, i.e., of a phantasmatic self-experience that cannot be reduced to external behavior, one should claim that what characterizes human subjectivity proper is, rather, the gap that separates the two, namely, the fact that fantasy, at its most elementary, becomes inaccessible to the subject. It is this inaccessibility that makes the subject empty. We thus obtain a relationship that totally subverts the standard notion of the subject who directly experiences himself via his inner states, an impossible relationship between the empty, non-phenomenal subject and the phenomena that remain inaccessible to the subject. In other words, psychoanalysis and Deleuze allows us to formulate a paradoxical phenomenology without a subject. Phenomena arise that are not phenomena of a subject, appearing to it. This does not mean that the subject is not involved here. It is, but, precisely, in the mode of exclusion, as the negative agency that is not able to assume these phenomena. In what, then, resides the gap between the neuroscientific image of the human mind and psychoanalysis? It is not simply that, while animals find the coordinates of their mating activity embedded in their natural instincts, humans lack them and therefore need their second nature, the symbolic institution, to provide them with these coordinates. The coordinates of the symbolic order are here to enable us to cope with the impasse of the other's desire, and the problem is that the symbolic order ultimately always fails. As Jean Laplanche points out, the traumatic impact of the primordial scene, the enigma of the signifiers of the other's desire, generates an excess that cannot ever be fully sublated in symbolic ordering. The notorious lack co-substantial with the human animal is not simply negative, an absence of instinctual coordinates, it is a lack with regard to an excess, to the excessive presence of traumatic enjoyment. The paradox is that there is signification precisely because there is an excessive, non-signifiable, erotic fascination and attachment. The condition of possibility of signification is its condition of impossibility. What if, then, the ultimate resort of the excessive development of human intelligence is the effort to decipher the abyss of Chavoy, the enigma of others' desire? What if therein resides the reason why humans are fixated on solving tasks that cannot be solved, on trying to answer unanswerable questions. What if the link between metaphysics and sexuality, or, more precisely, human eroticism, is to be taken quite literally? Ultimately, this dramatic, indigestible kernel, as the nonsensical support of sense, is the fundamental fantasy itself. As is well known, Wagner's musical hatred was directed against Meyerbeer, who, for him, stood for fake commercial Jewish music. What is less known is that, at the lowest point of his despair, on May 3, 1840, Wagner wrote a letter to Meyerbeer exhibiting a strange, groveling sycophancy stripped of the last vestiges of self-respect. It is Meyerbeer and Meyerbeer alone, and you will readily understand me when I tell you that I weep tears of the deepest emotion whenever I think of the man who is everything to me, everything. I realize that I must become your slave, body and soul, in order to find food and strength for my work, which will one day tell you of my gratitude. I shall be a loyal and honest slave, for I openly admit that I am a slave by nature. It gives me endless pleasure to be able to devote myself unconditionally to another person, recklessly, and in blind trust. The knowledge that I am working and striving for you, and you alone, makes that effort and industry seem all the more agreeable and all the more worthwhile. By me, therefore, sir, it is by no means a wholly worthless purchase. Your property, Richard Wagner. There probably has never been a more direct and shameless display of masochist enjoyment. Does this position of thorough and shameless servitude not render Wagner's fundamental fantasy, the disavowed core of his subjective identity that had to be denied in the guise of virulent anti-Semitism? It is precisely the status of fantasy that brings us to the ultimate point of the irreconcilable difference between psychoanalysis and feminism, that of rape, or the masochistic fantasies sustaining it. For standard feminism, at least, it is an a priori axiom that rape is a violence imposed from without. Even if a woman fantasizes about being raped, this only bears witness to the deplorable fact that she internalized male attitudes. The reaction is here one of pure panic. The moment one mentions that a woman may fantasize about being raped or at least brutally mishandled, one hears cries, "This is like saying that Jews fantasize about being gassed in the camps or African Americans fantasize about being lynched." From this perspective, the split hysterical position, that of complaining about being sexually misused and exploited while simultaneously desiring it and provoking man to seduce her, is secondary, whereas for Freud, it is primary, constitutive of subjectivity. Consequently, the problem with rape, in Freud's view, is that it has such a traumatic impact not simply because it is a case of such brutal external violence but because it also touches on something disavowed in the victim herself. So, when Freud writes, if what subjects long for most intensely in their fantasies is presented to them in reality, they nonetheless flee from it, his point is not merely that this occurs because of censorship but, rather, because the core of our fantasy is unbearable to us. The original side of fantasy is that of a small child overhearing or witnessing parental coitus and unable to make sense of it. What does all of this mean? The intense whispers, the strange sounds in the bedroom, and so forth? So, the child fantasizes a scene that would account for these strangely intense fragments. Recall the best-known scene from David Lynch's Blue Velvet, in which Kyle MacLachlan, hidden in the closet, witnesses the weird sexual interplay between Isabella Rossellini and Dennis Hopper. What he sees is a clear phantasmatic supplement destined to account for what he hears. When Hopper puts on a mask through which he breathes, is this not an imagined scene that is to account for the intense breathing that accompanies sexual activity? And, the fundamental paradox of the fantasy is that the subject never arrives at the moment when he can say, "Okay, now I fully understand it, my parents were having sex, I no longer need a fantasy." This is, among other things, what Lacan meant with his "il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel." Every sense has to rely on some nonsensical phantasmatic frame when we say, "Okay, now I understand it." What this ultimately means is now I can locate it within my phantasmatic framework. Or, to resort again to the old Derridian twist, fantasy as the condition of impossibility, the limit, of sense, the nonsensical kernel, is, at the same time, its irreducible condition of possibility. So, when, in Seminar XX, Encore, Lacan repeatedly asserts that there is something of the one / this one is not the totalizing one of the master signifier, but the supplementary partial object, organ without a body, that functions as the enabling obstacle of the sexual relationship, as its condition of, I'm, possibility. Y is thus strictly correlative to ILNY pas de rapport sexuel. The two sexual partners are never alone, since their activity has to involve a phantasmatic supplement that sustains their desire, and that can ultimately be just an imagined gaze observing them while they are engaged in sexual intercourse. Y means that every erotic couple is a couple of three, 1 + 1 + a, the pathological stain that disturbs the pure immersion of the couple. In short, this one is precisely that which prevents the fusion of the amorous couple into one. And, one can well argue that, in the case of a lesbian couple, this one is none other than phallus itself occasionally materialized in dildo, so that, when Judith Butler ironically proposes the term lesbian phallus, one should fully agree with her, just adding that this lesbian phallus is phallus tout court. Furthermore, not only is this real of the one not opposed to freedom, it is its very condition. The shocking impact of being affected or seduced by the enigmatic message of the other derails tidal subject's automaton, opens up a gap that the subject is free to fill in with his, ultimately failed, endeavors to symbolize it. Freedom is ultimately nothing but the space opened up by the traumatic encounter, the space to be filled in by its contingent / inadequate symbolizations / translations. In short, freedom is strictly correlative to the gap in inconsistency of the big other, the substantial symbolic order. The first move in the ideologico-critical debunking of the big other is the denunciation of its inherent stupidity. Recall Paul Robeson's later rewriting of his legendary Old Man River as a model of simple and efficient critico-ideological intervention. In the original version from the Hollywood musical Showboat, 1936, the river, Mississippi, is presented as the embodiment of the enigmatic and indifferent fate, an old wise man who must know something, but don't say nothing, and just keeps rolling, retaining its silent wisdom. In the new version now available in the indispensable recording of his notorious Moscow concert in 1949, Russian Revelation, RV 70004, with a brief spoken introduction by Robeson himself in perfect Russian, the river is no longer the bearer of an anonymous, unfathomable collective wisdom, but, rather, the bearer of collective stupidity, of the stupid, passive tolerance for meaningless suffering. This repositioning of the big other from wisdom to stupidity is crucial. Here are the final lines of the original song. You gets a little drunk, / and you land in jail. / but I gets weary, / and sick of tryin', / I'm tired of livin', / and scared of dyin'. / but ol' man river, / he just keeps rollin' along. And here is the changed version, you show a little grit, / and you lands in jail. / but I keeps login, / instead of cryin', / I must keep fightin', / until I'm dyin'. / and ol' man river, / he'll just keep rollin' along. Of course, one should not underestimate the emancipatory power of the original song in its historical context. For the first time in Hollywood, African Americans were presented as hard laborers caught in meaningless permanent suffering, that is, a white crack appeared in the standard image of them as happy children with no constraints, either smiling and dancing or getting drunk, horny and violent. Recall the racist cliché of a horny Negro from the Hollywood silent comedies. A black worker carries a large block of ice up the stairs to deliver it, when, through a crack in the half-open door, he sees a white woman taking a bath. He gets so aroused that the whole block melts on his back instantly. Is there not something almost charming in the unabashed directness of this cliché? However, the price of this serious depiction of suffering is that African Americans are portrayed as passive, resigned to their sad fate. But, again, one should not miss the point here. What the changed words accomplish is not the simple passage from the passive acceptance of fate into optimistic, active engagement and struggle. Recall that the last line of the new version remains the same, and ol man river, / he'll just keep rollin' along. In other words, the blind fate remains, but is deprived of its aura of unfathomable wisdom, reduced not simply to historical contingency but to the inherent stupidity of the ideological big other. The only good God is a dead God is effectively the founding statement of the big other, and, as such, far from a truly atheistic statement, one is even tempted to claim that the ultimate aim of theology is to mortify God, to keep him at a proper distance to prevent him getting too close to us and thus turning into a voracious monster. The support of the symbolic law is by definition a dead, castrated, God. The point of psychoanalysis is for sure atheism, on condition that we confer on this term a meaning different from that of God is dead, since everything indicates that this statement, far from undermining what is at stake here, namely the law, rather consolidates it. It is precisely in so-called totalitarian regimes that the non-castrated authority figure returns, in the guise of what one usually refers to as the father of the people who, according to Lacan, is related to the real father as the agent of castration. That is to say, the outside law, or loi, aspect of the totalitarian leader means precisely that, instead of himself assuming castration, the price to be paid for acting as the agent of the law, he himself turns into an agent of castration, strictly homologous to the Freudian primordial father. The second move consists in the shift of the emphasis to the barred, inconsistent, lacking, big other, to the question emerging from the other, che voi. With this shift, it is precisely the enigma that emerges, an otherness within the big other itself. Suffice it to recall the translation of the desire of the mother into the name of the father. Lacan's name for the enigmatic message is the desire of the mother, the unfathomable desire the child discerns in maternal caressing. The trademark of misleading introductions to Lacan is to conceive of the ensuing symbolic paternal function as the intruder that disturbs the imaginary symbiotic bliss of the mother-child dyad, introducing into it the order of symbolic prohibitions, i.e., order as such. Against this misperception, one should insist that father is, for Lacan, not the name of a traumatic intrusion but the solution to the deadlock of such an intrusion, the answer to the enigma. The enigma, of course, is the enigma of other's desire. What does she effectively want, above and beyond me, since I am obviously not enough for her? Father is the answer to this enigma, the symbolization of this deadlock. In this precise sense, father is, according to Lacan's account of the paternal function, a translation or a symptom, a compromise solution that alleviates the unbearable anxiety of directly confronting the void of the other's desire. The fundamental thrust of the entirety of Lacan's later teaching is that, today, this solution no longer works. The name of the father is no longer the symptom/symptom that holds together the social link. The political consequences of this insight are capital. Any possible idea of revolutionary undermining has to break totally with the problematic of anti-Oedipal revolt.